Welcome everyone. The topic for today is a broad residential property market update, but the question also is, are the stars aligning for downsizers? So we have two panelists today, and I'd like to introduce those. Our first is Jason Calleja, who's a Senior Adviser at FMD Financial. And Jason's going to talk to us about some of the technical and I guess tax effectiveness opportunities around downsizing perhaps the family home or a property that you've owned for some time. Why do we think that's an interesting proposition at the moment? Well, I guess it depends on where the residential property market is. And so we have David McMillan, who's a Director of Performance Property Advisory, who will join us and give us a bit of a market update. Some of you may have seen David speak to our client base before. He's always got some interesting things to say. I think last time, David, you spoke to us, it was fairly early on in the COVID, I guess, crisis period, and your views on what was going to happen in the market were quite different to others, and I think you'd probably say you were vindicated at that point. So looking forward to hearing what you've got to say today.
Thanks, Blake.
So what I might do, Jason, is just hand straight over to you. I'm in control of the slides today, gentlemen, so you just need to give me a nod or a wink or something more direct if you'd like me to change slides. But thank you everyone for joining us, and let's get started. Jason.
Great, thanks, Lee. So do you want to do a little bit of housekeeping first, or do we move straight on?
Yeah, so if you would like to, we'll have time at the end for questions. So if you would like us to take your questions, please type away in the Q&A box there. You'll access that from the top of your screen just by putting your mouse to the top of your screen. And at the end, just remember there'll be a quick survey, and we'd really welcome you taking the moment to give us some feedback on that. And that's about as good as I can go technically. If you have any trouble technically during this seminar, I guess the old advice is turn it on and turn it off again, and good luck. But we will have a recording of it. So if something happens in the session, we'll be able to provide you a recording at the end. All right, Jason, now I've done my housekeeping, I will hand over.
Thank you. So if you go to the next slide, Lee. Perfect. So just a quick introduction. So I'm going to go through some downsizer super contribution opportunities for those aged 60 and over, and then run through how you can potentially reduce capital gains tax if you sell an investment property. Depending on various different ages, it might be applicable to you. And then Lee touched on part 3 is David will go through the property market update from there. All right. Next slide, Lee. There we go. Okay, before we jump into downsizer super contributions and also some opportunities to reduce tax for investment properties, I thought I'd just give you an overview of the two main types of super contributions. So the first one in the purple box is concessional contributions. So they're pre-tax contributions. So think of things like if you're an employee, your employer pays 10% of your salary towards them. You could be salary sacrificing part of your income towards that. Or you've got the ability to make these personal deductible contributions, which is you make a contribution with some cash that's sitting in your bank account, and then you claim a tax deduction for those contributions, which helps reduce your tax bill. So that's going to tie in with what we're talking about to help reduce capital gains tax on an investment property sale. In terms of how they're taxed, they're generally taxed at 15 to 30% on entry to super, and the caps for these type of contributions are about $27,500 per annum. And you can potentially use some carry forward contributions, which I'll run through shortly. The other main types of contributions are in the green box, what we call non-concessional contributions. So they're after-tax contributions where you could use cash that's built up. It could be from a sale of a property. It could be from an inheritance, or you've just built up savings. There's no tax on those contributions upon entry to super. And the general caps are about $110,000 per annum per person. Or if you bring forward 2 years worth of contributions, you can do up to $330,000 in a single financial year. So those are two main types. And now I'd like to run through, I guess, the first opportunity, which is making downsizer super contributions. So this is something that was introduced in the last 3 or so years from the government. And initially you had to be 65 plus to be able to make these contributions. And now they've recently updated, I guess, the rules. So from 1 July 2022, the key condition is you need to be at least 60 or older at the time the contribution is made. So that's the first criteria. The next one is the property needs to be owned for at least 10 years. Okay, so most people will generally be in their home that we talk to that are downsizing have been in their property for a long time. So this isn't really that big of an issue, but it is a key criteria that you need to meet. The next one is it must be fully or partially exempt from CGT. So what that means is you need to have lived in the property for some period of that ownership. And this is an interesting one because most people, when they hear this downsizer super contribution opportunity, think of their primary residence being the home that they're in right now. But it could have been, it can be used on a property that you may have lived in for, let's say, a couple of years. Then you've moved into your home and you've rented out that property for the last 15 years. So that presents quite a significant opportunity for some people out there that have got investment properties that are looking to sell to get more money into super after the normal cutoff ages, which were 67, is going to 75 from 1 July 2022. In terms of, I guess, how much you can get into super using this downsizer super contribution, it's 300,000 per individual, or as a couple up to 600,000 to 300,000 each. And it's important to note that this sits outside of those caps that I talked about earlier, the non-concessional cap of 110,000 per annum or 330 if you bring forward a couple of years. This is completely separate to that. So it does present a significant opportunity to get money into super later in life. And there's a little asterisk there, and what it notes is it doesn't have to be from the sale proceeds. So this is another, I guess, little quirk in the system that you could sell let's say you sell your home and you downsize for all purposes, which sometimes doesn't free up that much money. But let's say, for example, you sell your home for $1 million and you buy something for 900,000. If you've got cash sitting outside that may have built up for other reasons, you can use those proceeds towards taking advantage of this downsizer super contribution. So just something to keep in mind there, that it does present quite a few opportunities. The next one is the contribution needs to be made within 90 days of settlement. So that's an important one to be aware of. It is quite a tight time period that you need to get the money in, and the ATO is quite strict around being able to do that. So just be conscious as soon as settlement happens to get moving with making the contribution. And then in the purple box, what you can see there is you can only use this once, so use it wisely. And the reason why I say that is, as I touched on, you could use the downsizer super contribution for potentially an investment property if you've lived in it in the past, or your primary residence. So it's worthwhile getting some advice around which of your caps to use, whether it's this downsizer super contribution cap, or maybe using your non-concessional cap in if you've got eligibility to use that, and then use this in a future year when you sell another property. So again, yeah, doing some planning around this can be quite important. There's a little asterisk at the bottom which mentions the work test doesn't apply for these type of contributions. So you could be 80 years of age and you've still got the opportunity to do this. You don't have to worry about meeting those conditions. And the other real key consideration is some of you may be aware with what they call the total super balance cap, which is about 1.7 million, or the pension transfer balance cap, which is how much you can have in the pension phase. This allows you, regardless of what your super balance is, to get the money into superannuation. Whereas if you weren't using this downsizer super contribution, you would be capped out once you go above that $1.7 million mark. Now, Lee, do you want to move across to the next slide where I've done an example that we can run through? Thanks for that. So I've got a little case study here. So we've got Alex and Susan. They're both in their 70s and each have $1 million in their respective super funds. Now, they've recently decided to sell their home. They've lived in that for the last 20 years and they've got a really healthy price of 1.9 million. They've actually gone the downsizer approach and moving into a townhouse, which costs 1.1 million. And as a result of that transaction, they've got about 800,000 left over, which they want to try and get into superannuation if possible, because it's quite tax effective and also it helps simplify their overall situation. So in the table on this slide, what you can see here is how we can try and get as much money into super as possible. So there's a line here, the second row, we've got downsizer super contribution. So Alice is going to take advantage of that and use 300 of that cap. Susan's also going to do the same. So between them, they're putting 600,000 in as a downsizer super contribution. And then they've also got the ability, given that they're under 75, to make a non-concessional contribution. So they each do 100,000 each, and that allows them to get the extra 200,000 in using the full 800,000. So this is a quite simple example of how you can get money into superannuation using the downsizer super contribution. But there are some, I guess, more complexities that we can run through, or I should say you should run through with your advisor to make sure you're using the caps in the most effective manner. The benefit of this strategy, which I sort of touched on earlier, is Alex and Susan are able to get the full 800,000 into superannuation. And based on their current balances, once you include the 400,000 that they're each putting into super, they're able to get that money into the pension phase, which is tax-free. So earnings are tax-free, no capital gains tax, and any pension payments and withdrawals are tax-free. So quite a significant benefit there, and they retain full access to those funds. So if something pops up in a couple of years' time, they haven't lost access, they can access those funds whenever they need. We'll now move along to the other type of contribution that you can make, and this is more around, I guess, if you're selling an investment property and you've got a tax bill that comes from that. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with what they call the carry forward unused concessional contributions. So to be able to take advantage of this type of contribution, you need to have a total super balance at the end of the previous financial year, so 30 June the previous year, of less than 500,000. Okay, so that's the first condition that not everyone ticks, but if you do tick that, it presents some significant opportunities. The next criteria that you need to meet is in the orange box. So some of you may be familiar that for the current financial year, the concessional contribution cap is 27,500, and for previous financial years, it's been around that 25,000 mark before there's been adjustments in the past. So from 1 July 2018, if you haven't used your full caps, so let's say, for example, you're simply just receiving your employer SG contributions of the 9.5 or the 10%, it's likely that you'd have some unused caps in there. So what the government introduced from 1 July 2018 is your unused caps carries forward for up to 5 financial years. And you then have the ability, if your balance is under 500,000, to use these caps in a single financial year. All right, and I'll run through an example shortly around the benefits of that. The key to this is the contribution needs to be made by 30 June in the year you want to claim a tax deduction. And the reason why I highlight this point is if we think about an investment property sale, if you sell the property in May and you've got a 90-day settlement. From a capital gains tax perspective, the sale date is the date that the ATO is looking at the financial year which the gain is realised in. Okay, settlement's 90 days, so that's going to push you past 30 June. So you won't receive the proceeds, majority of the proceeds, until the next financial year. And in order to make this contribution, you need to have those funds available to get the money in pre-30 June so you can take advantage of the tax deduction in the financial year that the capital gain is being realised. So the key point here is there are some complexities around the timing of it. It's important to get some advice around making sure that it all stacks up, because as you'll see on the following page when I go through, there's some significant tax benefits that can be realised. The last point on this slide is with all personal deductible contributions, you need to lodge what they call a notice of intent to claim a deduction form. So that needs to be signed and lodged and received by your super fund and acknowledged. So that way, when it matches up with the ATO, when you ultimately claim that as a tax deduction on your tax return there. All right, we'll move along to a case study that I've prepared. So in this example, we've got Sarah and Jordan. They're both 50 and they each have 400,000 in their respective super funds. So they're both under that 500,000 mark, which is what you need to be eligible for this type of contribution. Sarah earns 150,000 per annum and Jordan earns 120,000 per annum. And neither of them have been making any extra voluntary contributions. So just purely what their employer makes on their behalf. They recently sold an investment property for around $1 million, which they purchased in 2010 for 500,000, and the property's held in joint names. So based on them buying it for $1 million, buying it for 500,000, selling it for $1 million, they made a capital gain of 500,000 on that property. Some of you may be aware that if you hold an asset or an investment like in a property for over 12 months, you get a 50% discount. Therefore, the actual capital gain that's accessible for them both is 250,000. Now, in this case here, clearly 250,000 is a significant assessable gain that's going towards their assessable income. So they're going to have a decent tax bill and want to understand how they can reduce that tax bill there. So in the table that we've got on this slide, what we're looking at doing to try and help them reduce the tax bill is the second column, it's got a personal deductible contribution. So this is in the current financial year. So based on Sarah and Jordan's income and their employer making the 10% employer super guarantee contributions, Sarah has about 12,500 left in her 27,500 cap, and Jordan has about 15,500 left in their cap. Okay, so that's the first thing they want to maximize in the current financial year, which is about 28,000 between them. The next, row number 3 is where they're able to take advantage of the strategy, which is the carry forward unused concessional contributions. So I don't have the detail on this slide here, but by Sarah not using her caps since 1 July 2018, she essentially has about 32,250 available in her carry forward unused cap, and Jordan has 40,800 carried forward in the unused cap. So they both take advantage of this, which between them is about 73,050. So for a total contribution of 101,050, they get that into super. The benefit of this is that upon contributing those funds to super, it's taxed at a maximum of 15 to 30%, depending on their marginal tax rates. And they're able to significantly reduce their personal tax bill. So the overall tax saving, once we factor in what tax they'll pay on an entry to super, is about 27,000 between them. All right, so it's quite a meaningful amount that they're able to save on that transaction. Now, clearly they need to be mindful of, by contributing to the super, they can't access those funds until at least age 60 and need to meet a condition of release such as retiring, changing employers, or ultimately reaching age 65. They're the main 3 that generally come to mind. So the overall, I guess, summary of what I've talked about here is, for downsizers, those that are in, let's say, 60 plus, there's some significant opportunities if you free up some capital from the sale of a home, or if you have some cash outside upon the sale of a home to get that money into super. And for those that may be a bit younger or are just generally selling an investment property with a significant capital gain, there's a strategy here which can help you reduce a significant amount of tax upon the sale of that property. That's it for me, Lee, at this stage. So feel free to hand it over to David to talk through the market.
Thanks very much, Jason. And you've covered quite a lot of ground there in a relatively quick time. So I note that no one's popped a question up yet. But if anyone does have a question or would like Jason to clarify any of that, please just drop your question into the Q&A box and we'll come back to that. Okay, so I might proceed here. And David, welcome you to the panel and invite you to give us a market update. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. If you can flick to the next slide or the next couple of slides, go one further. Some of you may be familiar with performance property. If you're not, what we do is we help people build property portfolios between 2 and 50 million, and everything that involves: the advice, the buyer's advocacy, the sales advisory, the property management. Core to our business is our research program, where we spend $500,000 a year researching the market. And today I'm just going to give you some insights as to what we're seeing and where we think the market's going to go. As Lee mentioned before, pretty early on, we had a view that the market was going to be aggressive post-COVID. The driving factor being low interest rates, and interest rates were going to stay low for some time. We saw the demand on REA tick up, and we saw a lot of the key fundamental indicators start to tick up. So we had a view pretty early. Our clients positioned their money, and some of them have done very well. Now we've got a slightly different view, which I think is good, because most people think we're always bullish about property, but now we're a bit more pessimistic. It's certainly not across the board, but in a couple of key markets. The market at the moment for me, and we've been doing this for 15 years, is probably the easiest to read that in any other time, primarily because 2 things are going on. One, there's not enough property to go around, and 2, interest rates can't go down really. They can only go up. Right. So we know we're going to be facing a rising interest rate environment, but we also know there's a chronic undersupply. What you're seeing here is the capital city vacancy rates. And as you can see in every single market, the vacancy rate is trending down and has been trending down since 2018. A market is in balance if the vacancy rate is 3%, and if it's under 3%, it's moving into an undersupply, and if it's under 1%, the undersupply is pretty chronic, and you're going to see aggressive rental growth. So as you can see here in the capital cities, every vacancy rate is on the way down and under 3%, with Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth sub 1%. It's not just the capital cities that are an issue. Lee, if you go to the next slide. As you can see, all the major regional towns also have a supply issue with vacancy rates, not just below 3%, but pretty much all below 1%. So we have a national accommodation problem, and it's not something that can be fixed easily, and it's not something that can be fixed quickly. And that is one of the dominant themes in the market at the moment. If we go to the next slide, this is dwelling approvals since 2015, and you can see we've been on a downward trend since 2015. So we haven't been building enough for over 5 years. That has resulted in a chronic shortage of accommodation at a time when our borders have been shut, right? So once we open the borders and allow our overseas migration to flow, we're going to see the headlines dominated by this accommodation issue. Right, and it's going to put pressure on either rents or prices or both, and that's what we'll talk about. In terms of markets that are unaffordable, it'll put pressure on rents. In terms of markets that are affordable, it'll put pressure on both rents and prices. Right, and so what we're going to look at now is which markets are affordable, because every market's got an undersupply. Which markets are affordable versus which markets are not. So, Lee, if you go to the next slide. This is Sydney, and what the blue bar lines represent is the percentage of the average wage that goes to the average new mortgage in Sydney, right? And it goes back to 1980. 1980, 40% of the average wage went to the average new mortgage, and today 60% of the average wage in Sydney goes to the average new mortgage, right? The green lines there are the year-on-year price change, depending on how affordable or unaffordable the Sydney market was. And as you can see, every time the Sydney market gets to an affordability index of 60%, the corresponding year, the price in Sydney falls. So 60% is the point where Sydney can't get past 60% of the average wage going to the average new mortgage, and prices have always fallen. So we saw it in 89, we saw it in 04, we saw it in 08. We saw it in 2011, we saw it in 2017, and I think we're going to see it now in 2022, right? The difference between this time and last time is every time affordability was an issue, the RBA cut rates in subsequent years to recreate affordability, right? So if you go back to 1990, the affordability index was 67%, but then all of a sudden in the following years, affordability was improved dramatically, primarily because interest rates were cut. We won't see that in this cycle. And that's a big problem for property markets everywhere, especially for Sydney. So we think Sydney is peaking in price. The significance of Sydney peaking in price is that historically no market gets past Sydney in that cycle. So the Sydney median house price is $3.5 million. And effectively that sets the high watermark for every single market across the country in this cycle. When you go back through every previous cycle, no market has gone past Sydney. So we know that that's probably the price ceiling for everywhere. And it's the next challenge for us to work out is how much every market will run up close to Sydney in what we think is left of this cycle. So if you go to the next slide, Lee, the other thing that Sydney is experiencing is a record high price to income ratio. So the average house price in Sydney is 15 times the average income. And in our worldwide study, no capital city in the world gets past a price to income ratio of 14 times without correcting, unless it allows foreign capital into its markets, which Australia doesn't. Australia doesn't allow foreign capital into its established real estate market. It does into the new real estate market, but not the established real estate market. And so where foreign capital isn't allowed to flow into the established real estate market, no city in the world has gone past a price to income of 14 times, right? With the data that had available in the last 60 years. Right. So we have a pretty high conviction that Sydney is peaking at the moment and arguably starting to soften, and that's important because it sets the high watermark for the rest of the country. And we don't think any region or town will get past a median price of 1.3 million in this cycle. When we have a look at Melbourne, which I know is going to be interesting to most people on the call, if we go to the next slide. The affordability index threshold in Melbourne is really 55. When Melbourne hits an affordability index of 55, which is the blue bar lines there, typically the market will falter, okay? And as you can see, it's not quite at 55 at the moment, but what can take it to 55 is these rising interest rates, right? Because the affordability index is a measure of repayment, so debt service, and when interest rates rise, the percentage of the average wage will increase. And so we think that the Melbourne market, obviously it's gone on a run recently. We think that run is coming to an end. Mathematically, we don't see how it can continue. That doesn't mean that it can't continue, because you never say never and anything can happen. But, we have to draw a line in the sand so we can give our clients advice. And mathematically, I find it very difficult to see the Melbourne market running another 50%. Can it run more in a rising interest rate environment? Yes, and we'll go into the thresholds of that in a couple of slides. But as you can see, Melbourne is a bit more affordable than Sydney when we have a look at the percentage of the average wage that's consumed by the average new mortgage. When we look at the other side of the coin, if you can go to the next slide, Lee, when we look at the other side of the coin, which is Perth, Perth still has massive affordability. So only 23% of the average wage goes to the average new mortgage. It's substantially cheaper to buy a property in Perth than to rent it. And rents in Perth are skyrocketing because the vacancy rate is sub 1%. And there's queues around the block for rental properties in Perth. And there's something like 70,000 jobs waiting to be filled over there. So that's a real opportunity for those looking to invest in property. So I just wanted to show you both sides of the coin. If we go to the next slide, Lee, this is our property clock. This is what our $500,000 research spend. This is the end result. Tells us where all the markets are around the country right now. This is specifically for houses. It's not for units. There's a different clock for units. And as you can see, Sydney, Melbourne, the major regional towns of New South Wales, all starting to peak. And this, they'll slide down the dark side of the clock pretty quickly in this rising interest rate environment. So we are also expecting perhaps price softening in Sydney and maybe Wollongong and Newcastle. And just to explain this clock a little bit further, if we're lucky enough to buy at the bottom at 6 o'clock, what typically happens is we have 6 to 9 years of growth, and that growth is, using history as a guide, 50 to 150% in size. Market becomes too expensive for the local market, which is what we're seeing in Sydney at the moment. Then it goes into a correction, and those corrections typically last 4 to 7 years, and that's characterised by limited price softening or price stagnation, not price falls, but sort of just an evening of prices until such time as incomes catch up. So that's what we think the state of play is for the country. There's obviously some threats in there where prices can fall, but there's also some opportunities for those of you who may be still looking to invest. When we stress test this against interest rates, if we can go to the next slide, Lee, interest rate movements are 70% of the game when we're trying to understand how the property market's going to play out. So, you almost, if you're going to forecast where prices are going to go, you've got to qualify it by forecasting interest rates. And we're not interest rate forecasters, and therefore we can't really forecast price. But notwithstanding that, we have to come up with models that help us make better decisions for our clients. And so what we've done here, we've done 3 scenarios. One is a cash rate of 150 basis points. The other one's 200 basis points. And the other one is 300 basis points. And the likely variable rate underneath that, which is 4, 4.5, and then 5.5. And then what the market would likely do in those scenarios. Okay. And so as you can see, in every one of those scenarios, prices in Sydney soften. In scenario 1, if the cash rate gets to 150 basis points, we still think the Melbourne market's probably going to run another 10%. And it's hard to see that at the moment because we've had the pre-election softness and the clearance rate's been sliding. But the fundamental theme that's going to run through all markets over the next 3 years is there's not enough accommodation, and therefore rents will rise, and then prices will rise to the extent that they can rise. And that's their long-term affordability ceilings, which is why I showed those slides earlier. That's our theory of markets. Our theory of markets is if the market is undersupplied and markets go on a run, they will rise until they can't rise anymore. And I think that helps us navigate the landscape. As you can see, we still think substantial growth in some other markets around the country. And in fact, we're buying there day in, day out for clients, and people that are worried about interest rate rises, even if the cash rate got up to 300 basis points and the rate of borrowing got up to 5.64, the Perth market can still rise 80%. Now, we don't think that the cash rate will get to 300 basis points, primarily because Sydney would probably correct 20%. And we don't think the RBA wants that. To have the largest property market, arguably you could define that as a crash. So that's their challenge at the moment. If they raise rates, the Sydney market will come off. If they raise rates too far, the Sydney market will come off. If they raise rates too far, it'll disincentivize home ownership, and then you'll have a bigger problem in the rental market because there won't be enough properties to go around. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. And from my side, it's always because this is what we study, it's a bit of a joy to watch, and we'll have a crack at how we're going to see it play out. But fundamentally, it is, and if we go to the next page, Lee, it is an opportunistic time to take some money off the table in certain markets. But conversely, if there are people out there wanting to invest in property, there's a 6 to 18 month window before I don't think we can run with the residential growth strategy, right? So there are some markets that we can invest in for growth right now. 18 months from today, I don't think we'll be able to do that, which will be the first time in our 10 years of business that we haven't been buying growth products for clients. We think the market will then reopen up again. The New South Wales regional markets and Sydney will open up again between 2025 and 2030 to invest again. So it's going to be a long time after this 6 to 18 month window before we can invest again in a growth strategy, an effective growth strategy. And from 2023, our business will change significantly, and we'll be recommending a lot of high yielding property assets to incorporate into our clients' portfolio. Importantly, for a lot of people on this call, though, it may be time to consider selling. If you're looking for an opportunistic time, if you're looking for a time when it's either at the top of the cycle or close to the top of the cycle, I think that time is now. That's what the data is telling us. It's not a perfect prediction, obviously, because there's so many different variables that go into it. But I think mathematically, it's very challenging for the market to continue to rise in a rising interest rate environment in Melbourne and Sydney because of how high prices already are. And there's one last slide, Lee, and then we'll open up for questions. And this is, I'm stating the obvious because, it is obvious. Rising interest rates are going to produce headwinds for all markets across the country. But it will cause some markets to fall, and it will cause other markets to rise less. Okay. So there are markets that are still going to rise. The residential market is undersupplied. This is going to be a problem that it's going to dominate the media, I think, in the next 12 months. It's not an easy fix. Even if they had a fix today, it's still going to take 3 years to see bedrooms on the other side. So we could be in an undersupplied real estate market for 3 or 4 years. And if we start taking 200,000 migrants every year, like we usually do, I think we're going to see the most aggressive rental growth that we've seen since the early 2000s. So double-digit rental growth is probably going to dominate the headlines for the next couple of years. Most markets in New South Wales and Melbourne are either close to their peak or have peaked, and we've got to consider sell rating on them. It doesn't mean you should sell. It just means that you should consider it in line with everything else that's going on, and try and make the best decision possible. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks. Thank you very much, David. Thanks very much for that. comprehensive update on and covered a lot of ground in a fairly short period of time. So I'm sure we do have a few questions. If I may, before we hand over to questions though, and that is FMDN Performance Property Advisory, have been working on a service for our clients, which is really targeted and very relevant to today's conversation. And that's an investment property portfolio review service. So obviously our clients are very familiar with our investment reviews and our portfolio reviews and our reviews that we would do every year or every 6 months with you. This service is in addition to that. And for those of you who might be considering the appropriateness of realising some either your family home or investment properties, then this service may be of interest. What you get access to is a comprehensive review from the David's team, and you get a personalised report on your individual properties against that property clock that David shared with us before. Some information about your individual property and how that rates relative to the market, and then a recommended action to consider. The team will present that to you probably on a video call, and subsequent to that, if you're interested in taking action, then you're welcome to avail yourself of the services of performance property advisors there to either help you divest or even reinvest if that's something you desire. So it's a new service that we've really been only recently introduced, and we're trialing with just one or two of our advisors at the moment, but we thought quite relevant to today. So I thought I'd do a little ad on that service and just speak to your advisor after this meeting if you have any questions about that. Okay. If I do go to questions, then the first question is about the downsizer policy, and Jacqueline asks, does the government downsizer policy affect the market, or how will it affect the market? David, probably a question for you, I think.
Well, firstly, I just wanted to, I'm here with Michael Scudds, who's the director of our sales advisory division. So he might answer any Melbourne sales questions direct. Is the question, will this government policy around, the being able to put money in super affect the market? Is that the question?
Do you think, David, that the policy itself will affect the market? I think if I reflect, the purpose of one of the intentions of the policy was to free up the family homes in the leafy suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney for the next generation to live in them. But what impact will that have, do you think, on the market, if any?
I don't think it's gonna. I think it would be a secondary impact, and it's very hard to quantify, because it's not something that we can study and look at historical precedent. I think if the benefits were larger, as in you could put in much more, I think perhaps, but it's impossible for me to say, Lee. I don't know.
Yeah. Lee, I might just step in there. In terms of the opportunity's been there for at least a couple of years now. I think it's fair to say, David, that it hasn't really had much impact on the growth of especially the Melbourne and Sydney property market. So I wouldn't think it is going to have much impact on the market. It's more of an opportunity, like Lee said, or an incentive to potentially downsize and free up that property for the next generation coming through.
Next question is from David, and and David McMillan, you've alluded to this in our preparation for this conversation, but can you comment on the difference between house prices and unit prices in Melbourne, both rental and value?
Yeah, so I mean, depending on what sort of unit you're holding, there hasn't been, like, if you're holding a high density unit, you really haven't seen any growth in the last decade. If you're holding a villa unit or something like that, you probably have seen some growth. So units are harder to predict than houses, because townhouses, villa units, high density units, they all get thrown into the same data pool. Right? That's the first thing that I'll say. But the gap between houses and units is as wide as it's ever been. And because houses are becoming unaffordable, that in theory should send demand towards the unit market in Melbourne. And we are optimistic about where Melbourne units are going to go. We think that they'll have moderate growth over the medium term. Nothing stays down forever. And when you think about an undersupplied market, and people, if they can't afford a house, well, they can either rent or they can buy a unit. And so some will elect to rent and some will elect to buy a unit, and that'll put demand in the rental market, the unit market pool, and they should rise.
And what about rentals for rental prices for
both?
Both. Yeah.
All rental prices everywhere are going to run.
Great. Thanks. We've got also a question, and I know it was touched on the property clock. I can bring that up again if you'd like, but could you give a quick summary on the direction of the Canberra market?
So Canberra houses are coming to an end. They are coming to an end. I think in our modelling, we had them running another 25%. So they're a fair way through the cycle, still some room to move. If the question was around units probably have around 70% to run. But Canberra, like everywhere, is undersupplied. And, rents will rise, but houses are getting too expensive.
Great. No major movement in the property market following the weekend's election?
Too early to tell, but yeah, who knows? I don't think, look, I mean, unless the government's talking about dramatically changing something like they were back in the previous election, a lot of the things that the government does is secondary, such as these incentives and whatnot. Even their new, equity ownership scheme or whatever they're calling it, that'll be a secondary influencer on the market. It won't dominate it. But if, the moment you talk about taking away negative gearing, well, that's a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah, and that lesson's been learnt. Okay, well, they're all the questions that we have at the moment. I might just pause for a minute to see if anyone does have one more burning question they'd like to type in and ask. No? Okay. Well, look, let me just thank again our panelists. Jason Calleja, thank you very much. And David McMillan, thank you also for sharing your insights and the fruits of your research and labour. We really appreciate that. We would invite any questions from this session to be directed to your advisor, and we will make connections, if you'd like, with Performance Property Advisors. Thank you very much for all of our clients who attended today. And on that basis, right on 12:45 on time, I will wrap this session up and thank everyone for attending. Have a great day. Thank you.